The wind that scoured the high plains of the Wyoming Territory had a memory of glaciers. It was a dry, scouring cold that snapped the dead grass and carried the grit of a late spring snow. Down from the Bighorn Mountains it came, a relentless breath that flattened the smoke from the Arapaho lodges huddled at the edge of the pine forest. In the distance, the town of Dry Willow was little more than a smudge of brown dust and raw lumber. Two streets that looked like a deep scratch on the height of the world. Ayanna lay flat on a low rise, the wool of her trade blanket a poor shield against the wind's teeth. Her pony, patient and stout, stood tethered in a shallow draw behind her, its head low. A thin, silver scar ran the length of Ayanna's cheekbone, a line drawn by a hired gun's bullet years ago during a raid that had smelled of whiskey and greed. The memory was a cold stone in her gut, a reminder of what happened when the earth was seen only for the silver it held. Her purpose was as clear and hard as that memory to keep her people safe, to keep the ancient hunting paths open, the paths her grandmother had walked, miles away, and 1,000 feet higher in the stony arms of the mountains. Elias Whitlock scraped the last of the burnt beans from his skillet. He was a man past 40, his face a map of sun and wind, his deerskin clothing worn to the color of the earth itself. His long rifle, a Hawken that had been his father's, leaned against the rock wall of his lean-to. He lived between the pines and the sky, a life of solitude chosen to quiet the noise in his soul. That noise was the memory of a survey team he had guided into a valley, a place he later learned was sacred to the Arapaho. He had not known they carried iron stakes and paper laws. He had only known the money was good, and their questions were about the rock formations. The guilt of that mistake clung to him like frost. He had a debt to pay, but he did not know to whom or how. The man who had paid him for that survey, Caldwell, did not think of debts. He thought of dividends. As the director of the Gray Butte silver mine and the railroad spur that would service it, his ambition was a locomotive engine, powerful and blind to the landscape it devoured. From his office in Dry Willow, he controlled Sheriff Pritchard with a steady flow of cash and promises, ensuring the law saw things his way. His current obsession was a new rail line, a shortcut that would slice directly through the sacred valley of the Arapaho, a valley he believed held a rich vein of silver. He would get his silver to the east, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. The world shattered in a bloom of orange fire and black smoke. Ayanna felt the concussion through the frozen ground, a deep thud that vibrated up through her bones. She rose to a crouch, her eyes fixed on Coyote Pass, a freight wagon. The kind she had seen hauling heavy machinery to the mine was now a fountain of splintered wood and twisted metal. It had not been an accident. The clean, sharp crack of dynamite was unmistakable. Elias, cleaning his rifle, saw the black plume rise against the pale sky. He knew that pass. He knew the freight schedule. He stood, his quiet morning ruined, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He grabbed his spyglass and climbed a familiar outcrop of granite. Ayanna was already moving, her pony scrambling down the loose scree with the sureness of a mountain goat. The air in the pass was thick with the acrid smell of burnt powder and scorched pine. The horses that had pulled the wagon were gone, likely vaporized or bolted in terror. The wagon itself was a wreck, its cargo of industrial drills and blasting equipment scattered like a giant's dropped tools. Amid the debris, something small moved. A boy, no older than 16, was crawling from beneath a shattered wagon wheel, his face pale with shock, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. Ayanna slid from her pony, her knife in her hand, her movements fluid and silent. She approached the wreckage with caution, her eyes scanning the rocks above for any sign of ambush. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear. He was just a messenger, a town boy named Tommy who ran errands for anyone with a coin. She knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice low and calm. Tommy shook his head, his teeth chattering from cold and terror. "I do not know. It just blew." He coughed, a dry, dusty sound. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to listen," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I heard them. In the saloon. Caldwell's men. They are going to level the ancestral burial ground tonight. Blast it for the rail spur." The word struck Ayanna harder than any bullet. The old willow grounds. The resting place of generations. It was not just land. It was family. It was their story, carved in stone and bone. High above, Elias focused his spyglass. He could make out the figure of the Arapaho scout and the boy in the smoking ruins. Then his lens found something else. A piece of the wagon's rear axle, thrown 100 yards by the blast. Hanging from it, torn but still recognizable, was a small pennant. A flag bearing the intertwined letters CRC, Caldwell Railroad Company. The same insignia that had been on the survey stakes he had helped plant. The cold reality washed over him. He had been used again, a pawn in the same man's brutal game. His conscience, a long, dormant beast, began to stir. He started down the mountain. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, was now spitting ice. Sleet began to fall, tiny pellets that hissed in the hot metal of the wreckage and turned the dust to a greasy mud. By the time Elias reached the floor of the pass, the world was shrouded in a gray mist. He saw Ayanna first, a silhouette against the smoke. She was wrapping the boy's arm with a strip of cloth torn from her own shirt. She looked up as he approached, her hand moving instinctively to the handle of her tomahawk. She saw a white man, large and weathered, carrying a long rifle. He was another threat until proven otherwise. "The boy needs a doctor," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands in plain sight. "There are no doctors in Dry Willow for my people, or for boys who carry tales against men like Caldwell," Ayanna countered, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe not," Elias conceded, "but he will not survive the night out here." He looked at the wreckage, then back at her. This was Caldwell's work. It was a statement, not a question. "It is always his work," she said. "He wants to break our spirit by breaking our ancestors' bones." "You mean the old willow grounds," Elias said, and the name felt like ash in his mouth. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that name?" "I guided the men who first put stakes there," he admitted, the words tasting like poison. "I did not know what they were doing. Not until it was too late." A bitter smile touched her lips. "That is what all of you say. I did not know." "Your ignorance is a weapon you use to take everything." A flash of anger sparked in Elias's eyes. "I live in these mountains because I turned my back on that world, on their paper maps and their lies." "You cannot turn your back on the tracks you have made," she shot back. "They are still on the ground. Your tracks led them right to our sacred land. The land does not belong to you. It does not belong to anyone. We belong to it." "And what is your law?" he challenged, gesturing to the smoking ruin. "Blowing up wagons, is that how you protect it?" "Our law is survival," she said, her voice fierce. "When your law comes with dynamite and rifles to take our homes, we are left with nothing but our own hands. We must take this boy to Dry Willow. He is a witness. He must tell people what he heard." Elias looked at the boy, who was shivering uncontrollably now, his face ashen. He knew she was right, but he also knew what awaited them in Dry Willow. Sheriff Pritchard was Caldwell's dog. The town was full of people who feared the Arapaho or worked for the mine. "They will not listen," he said grimly. "They will call you a liar and him a frightened boy. They will throw you in a cell. Then they will do it," Ayanna said, her jaw set. "But they will hear the truth first." She stood and walked to her pony, pulling the boy gently to his feet. He leaned heavily against her, his strength failing. A reluctant partnership was forged in the freezing sleet and the shadow of Caldwell's violence. It was a fragile thing, born of a shared, immediate need. Elias knew the trails, the shortcuts that could get them to town before Caldwell's men could sweep the area. Ayanna had the will, a fire that burned so brightly it seemed to hold the cold at bay. Together, They would escort a young witness across a hostile landscape, armed with a truth that most people did not want to hear. Their journey was not just about saving a boy or a piece of land. It was about justice, about whose laws and whose history would be allowed to survive under the cold Wyoming sky. Elias helped her get Tommy onto the pony, the boy slumping forward over the animal's neck. The scent of wet leather and damp wool filled the air, mingling with the lingering smell of the explosion. The horses snorted, their breath pluming in the icy air, sensing the storm that was coming, both from the sky and from the world of men. Elias looked at Ayanna, at the hard line of her jaw and the deep resolve in her dark eyes. He saw the scar on her cheek, a testament to a pain he could only imagine. For the first time in a long time, he felt the pull of a purpose greater than his own solitary penance. He had made tracks he could not erase, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could make new ones. They entered Dry Willow not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of a weary pony through streets of thick, red mud. The sleet had passed, but the sky remained the color of a bruised plum, promising more. The town huddled under this sky, a collection of raw pine buildings that seemed to have sprung from the earth in a state of perpetual surprise. There was the Juniper Saloon, a 2-story affair with a lamplight already glowing yellow in its windows. Across the street, the United States Post Office shared a roof with a general store, its porch sagging under the weight of barrels and crates. Further down, a simple wooden church pointed a stark, lonely steeple toward the unforgiving heavens. Faces appeared in windows and doorways, eyes lingering on Ayanna, on the slumped figure of the boy, and on the mountain man who walked beside them. The stairs were a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a deep-seated prejudice that was as much a part of the town as the dust itself. There were Irishmen with the railroad pallor still on their faces, a few quiet Chinese laborers who moved along the edges of the street, and a handful of Union Army veterans whose gaits were still stiff from old wounds. Elias led them straight to the saloon. It was the only place in town that offered warmth without asking for a man's soul in return. He pushed the bat-wing doors open and a wave of warm air, thick with the smell of sawdust, stale beer, and frying bacon, washed over them. The conversations within faltered, then died completely. Every eye turned to the strange trio framed in the doorway. A woman with hair the color of corn silk and a no-nonsense look in her blue eyes wiped the bar with a rag. "Elias," she said, her voice even. "You look like you have been wrestling a badger. And you brought friends." "May," Elias grunted, his voice hoarse from the cold. He helped Ayanna ease Tommy from the pony's back. The boy was barely conscious, his face slick with a feverish sweat. "The boy's hurt. Needs a place to lie down, somewhere warm." May Juniper's gaze softened as she took in the boy's condition. She rounded the bar without a word, her movements efficient. "Back room. There is a cot. Bring him through." She looked at Ayanna, taking in the buckskin leggings and the fierce, weary set of her face. "You too. You both look half frozen." As they settled Tommy onto a narrow cot behind a curtained doorway, May returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths. She handed Ayanna a heavy, dark wool coat. "This was my husband's. He has no more need of it, and you look like the wind goes right through you." Ayanna took the coat, surprised by the simple, unconditional kindness. She met the woman's eyes. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," May said, her voice low. "Trouble follows men like Caldwell, and anyone who crosses him. I saw the smoke from the pass." Before they could say more, the saloon doors swung open again, this time with a sharp crack. Sheriff Pritchard stood there, a big man whose authority came more from his gut and the silver star pinned to his stained vest than from any sense of justice. His eyes, small and porcine, immediately found Elias and Ayanna. "Whitlock," he barked. "What is this I heard there was some commotion? You dragging this squaw into my town to cause problems?" Elias stepped between the sheriff and the curtained alcove. The boy was in a wagon that blew up in the pass. "Sheriff, he is a witness. He heard Caldwell's men planning to dynamite the Arapaho burial ground tonight. Pritchard laughed, a short, ugly sound, a witness to what a scared boy's fever dream. There is no complaint filed. Whitlock, no complaint, no crime. Now, I suggest you take this Indian and her mountain stray of a friend and get out of Dry Willow before I decide to lock you all up for vagrancy. He patted the butt of his pistol, a clear and obvious threat. He was a man who had long ago traded his spine for the contents of a heavy envelope. "He is just a boy. Pritchard," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "He needs a doctor." "Then take him to the reservation doctor," the sheriff sneered. "This is a white town, with white laws." He turned and strode out, letting the doors swing shut behind him, leaving a chill in the room that had nothing to do with the weather. May Juniper quietly took a piece of paper and a pen from behind the bar, while pretending to tally her accounts. She began to write, her script small and neat. She would send the letter with the next morning's stagecoach, addressed to the county judge in Laramie. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. An hour later, as a fragile quiet settled over the saloon, two riders trotted down the main street. They moved with the lazy arrogance of men who were paid to be dangerous. The taller one, Kiefer, had a long, drooping mustache and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His partner, Smalls, was a compact bundle of muscle with a perpetually sour expression. They were Caldwell's bounty hunters, his preferred method of sending a message. They dismounted not at the saloon, but in front of the post office, without a word. Kiefer drew his revolver and fired a single shot, the crack echoing through the town. The bullet splintered the freshly painted sign, blowing the Owen office into a jagged hole. It was a calculated act of intimidation, a reminder to the entire town of who held the real power. Then they sauntered into the Juniper Saloon, their spurs ringing on the floorboards, and ordered whiskey. Ayanna had watched them from the window. She knew their kind. Men who would kill for coin and call it work. The air grew thick with unspoken threats, needing space to breathe. She slipped out the back door. The raw wind felt good on her face. Her path took her past the small wooden church. The door opened and a man in a black coat, the town's preacher, stepped out. He saw her and his face tightened with a mixture of piety and disdain. "You are one of the Arapaho," he said. It was not a question. Ayanna simply nodded. "Your people should not be here," the preacher continued, his voice taking on a sermonizing tone. "This is a civilized place, a place of God. We are trying to build a community here, based on law and property. Your people, you wander. You do not own the land. You merely exist upon it. Mr. Caldwell brings progress, a railroad that will connect us to the nation." Ayanna's eyes flashed. "Your progress is a steel blade cutting our mother's skin. Your law is a piece of paper that claims you own the sky. Your civilization builds a church on one street and a saloon on the other and calls them both God's will. The ground you call property, we call history. Our ancestors are buried there. Their spirits watch over us. To destroy their graves is to tell us we were never here." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Whispers rustled like dry leaves. Savage talk. Listen to her, blaspheming. The verbal violence was 100 tiny cuts, exposing the raw nerve of a society built on the erasure of those who came before. The preacher puffed out his chest. "The Lord helps those who help themselves to build a better world. He does not reward pagan rituals for ghosts in the dirt." "Our ghosts have longer memories than your God," Ayanna said, her voice dropping to a steely quiet. She turned her back on him and walked away, the whispers of the crowd following her like a foul wind. Back in the saloon storeroom, which smelled of potatoes and damp earth, Elias had unrolled a set of old maps on a crate. They were drawn on tanned hide. The ink faded, showing the contours of the mountains and valleys as known by the fur trappers who had come and gone a generation ago. They showed the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the paths that did not appear on any government survey. He was plotting a route to Laramie, a way around Caldwell's patrols. Ayana entered, her face a mask of controlled anger. She watched him for a moment, his large, calloused hands tracing a line through the Bighorn foothills. "I know these passes," he said without looking up. "We can avoid the main trails." He hesitated. Then his fingers stopped on a particular valley, the one that led to the old willow grounds. "I added to this map once, for a survey team." The confession came out low and rough, like stones being dragged from a deep well. "I drew this section for them. I thought I was just mapping rock. I did not know I was drawing a target on your ancestors' backs." Ayana looked at the lines he had drawn, lines made with his own hand. She saw the shame in the set of his shoulders, the deep regret etched around his eyes. It was not an excuse. It was a confession. The anger she had felt outside began to cool, replaced by a different, more complicated understanding. She saw a man trapped by his own past, just as her people were trapped by his. "The tracks are made," she said quietly. "Now we must choose which new ones to make." It was then that they knew staying in Dry Willow was impossible. The law was a shut door. Killers were drinking in the next room. Their only hope lay with the county judge, a man they did not know, miles away across a dangerous land. Ayana walked over to the crate. She drew the dagger from her belt, its handle carved from the bone of an elk, and placed it on the map between them. The polished bone gleamed in the lantern light. "We will take the boy to the county judge," she declared, her voice resonating with unshakable purpose. "We will take him to Laramie. If your law will not protect the innocent, I will." Elias looked from the knife to her face. He saw no fear, only a calm, unbending will that seemed as strong and timeless as the mountains on his map. He had spent years in solitude, trying to escape the world of men. Now, he was being pulled back in by this woman, by a cause he could not deny. He recognized the guilt in his own eyes reflected in her determination. They were still two strangers, a mountain man and an Arapaho warrior, separated by a chasm of history and pain, but in that small, dusty room, with a dying boy on a cot and killers in the next room, a new path began to form. They were no longer just a man and a woman, but two currents joining in a single, powerful river, moving toward an unknown sea. The rhythm of their breathing seemed to fall into sync, a quiet beat against the coming storm. They slipped out of Dry Willow while the darkness was still thick and deep. A velvet cloak over a sleeping town. May Juniper had given them a sack with a loaf of bread, a slab of salted bacon, and a small tin of coffee. A silent act of rebellion performed in the pre-dawn gloom. The only sounds were the soft scuff of their boots in the mud and the weary sigh of Ayana's pony, its breath a white plume in the frigid air. As they cleared the last of the silent buildings, the wind hit them, a physical blow that carried the scent of snow and pine. From a distant bluff, a lone wolf howled, a lament that was swallowed by the immense, empty landscape. The rising sun was not a promise of warmth, but a sliver of sharp, cold light on the horizon, like the edge of a newly honed blade. Out here, life was stripped to its essentials: water, fire, salt, and bullets. Every ounce they carried, every decision they made, was weighed against the simple, brutal calculus of survival. The path Elias chose was a faint game trail that wound its way upward into the foothills, a rugged, broken country of rock and stunted cedar. It was a route that would keep them off the main freight road, hidden from casual view. But the terrain was treacherous, patches of black ice, hidden beneath a dusting of fresh snow, lurked on the trail. Ayana's pony, carrying the feverish Tommy, suddenly lost its footing. Its hooves scrabbled desperately on a slick sheet of frozen stone, and it went down with a grunt of alarm, sliding precariously close to the edge of a steep ravine. Ayana moved with a speed that belied her exhaustion. She threw herself at the pony's head, grabbing its bridle, her voice a low, calming murmur in its ear as she fought to keep it from panicking and tumbling into the void. Elias was there a second later, his shoulder braced against the animal's flank, pushing, digging his heels into the frozen earth for purchase. Together, straining in the thin, biting air, They managed to heave the frightened animal back onto the solid part of the trail. Tommy, who had been jarred by the fall, moaned, his eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. The incident left them all trembling, a stark reminder of how quickly the indifferent landscape could claim them. As the morning wore on, Ayanna kept her eyes on the sky. The clouds that had been thin and scattered at dawn were now gathering, their bellies growing dark and heavy. "A storm comes," she said, her voice flat. She pointed to the west, where the clouds were churning, forming a solid wall of gray, the kind that brings white darkness. Elias squinted, reading the signs she had indicated. He had seen storms like this before, blizzards that could appear out of a clear sky and bury a man in a matter of hours. "We need to find shelter, a deep ravine, an overhang, something to break the wind." They pushed onward, the urgency a new spur in their sides. But the storm moved faster. The wind began to shriek, and the air filled with a blinding swirl of snow. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white, visibility dropping to mere feet. They were in an exposed stretch of canyon, the rock walls on either side offering no real protection. "Here!" Elias yelled over the roar of the wind, pointing to a large snowdrift that had piled up against a granite cliff face. "We will dig." Using his hands and the butt of his rifle, he began to hollow out the drift, carving a cave into the packed snow. Ayanna joined him, her movements quick and efficient, scooping away the snow. It was exhausting, punishing work. The cold seeped through their clothes, numbing their fingers and faces. Inside the small shelter, the roar of the wind muted to a dull moan. It was cramped and cold, but it was a refuge from the storm's fury. They settled Tommy inside, the boy shivering violently despite being wrapped in every spare blanket they had. His fever was climbing. Elias took out his knife and, without hesitation, cut a long strip from the top of his worn leather possibles bag. He uncorked his canteen and dampened the strip of leather, gently laying it across the boy's forehead. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. That bag held everything he needed to survive in the mountains. It was a part of him. Ayanna watched him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then she unfastened her own deerskin cloak, the one she had worn for years, softened by countless rains and suns. She folded it carefully and slid it under Tommy's head for a pillow. A silent reciprocity passed between them, a fragile thread of trust being woven in the heart of the blizzard. Hours passed. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the only sounds were the boys' shallow breathing and the whisper of their own. The pursuit, for the moment, was forgotten, replaced by the more immediate battle against the cold. When the storm finally broke near dusk, it left behind a world transformed. Every surface was coated in a thick blanket of pristine white, the landscape rendered smooth and deceptively beautiful. As they emerged from their snow cave, stiff and cold, they saw the tracks, 2 sets of them, not 100 yards from where they had sheltered. Kiefer and Smalls. They had passed by during the height of the blizzard, completely blind to their presence. "They are ahead of us now," Elias said, his voice a low growl. He examined the tracks. They did not stop. "They are riding hard for the next pass, thinking to cut us off." They pressed on, moving with renewed caution. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of their pursuers. Late in the afternoon, as they navigated a narrow defile choked with fallen rock, Ayanna held up a hand, signaling a halt. She slid from her pony and crept forward, disappearing behind a jumble of boulders. Elias waited, his rifle ready. She returned a few minutes later, holding something small and metallic in her palm, a spent cartridge casing. Still bright, it was from a Sharp's rifle, the kind Kiefer favored. It was not old. The smell of burnt powder still clung to it. "They were here," she said quietly, waiting. The knowledge that they had been in an ambush spot so recently sent a fresh chill down Elias's spine. The hunters had become the hunted. They were being herded. The echo of a horseshoe striking stone from the trail behind them confirmed it. Kiefer and Smalls had circled back. They were closing in. "Get the boy moving," Ayanna commanded, her voice calm and sharp. She pulled her own rifle from its scabbard. "I will slow them down." Elias did not argue. He grabbed the reins of the pony and urged it forward, deeper into the rocky maze. Ayanna climbed a small outcrop that gave her a clear view of the back trail. She saw them then. 2 riders picking their way carefully through the rocks, about 400 yards back, too far for a pistol, but within range of her rifle. She rested the barrel of the Winchester on a rock. Steadying her aim, she could have aimed for one of the men. It would have been an easy shot, but she saw Tommy's pale face in her mind, and the promise she had made to get him to safety. A gunfight here would get them all killed. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. It was a single, deliberate shot. Down the trail, one of the horses screamed, a high, panicked sound. It reared, unseating its rider. Ayanna had not hit the horse. She had hit its rein, severing the leather strap an inch from the bit. The animal, now uncontrollable, bolted, bucking and kicking, disappearing back the way it had come. Smalls, thrown to the ground, was left on foot. Kiefer reined in his own mount, firing a wild shot in her direction that ricocheted harmlessly off the rocks far above her head. Ayanna was already gone, sliding back down the rocks and leaping onto her own horse. Catching up to Elias, they had bought themselves time. As they rode, they came upon a place where the landscape was scarred and blackened. A section of a limestone cliff had been blasted away, the raw, white stone exposed to the air like a fresh wound. The ground was littered with shattered rock. "Dynamite," Elias said, dismounting to examine the damage. "This is new." Ayanna ran her hand over the blasted rock. "They are testing, seeing how the stone breaks. This is near the old willow grounds." Elias looked around, and his heart sank. A few yards away, almost hidden in a clump of sagebrush, was a wooden stake driven into the ground. On its top was a small metal cap, stamped with the letters USFS, United States Federal Survey. It was a sight he knew too well. He remembered the feel of the mallet in his hand, the dull thud as he had driven similar stakes into the earth of another valley, a valley he now knew was sacred. He had been an instrument of this slow, methodical invasion, this remaking of the world with paper and iron. Whose law, he muttered to himself, the question a bitter taste in his mouth. Ayanna heard him. She looked from the survey stake to the blasted cliff. "My grandmother used to say that the land remembers," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It remembers the steps of those who keep their promises, and it remembers the steps of those who break them." The weight of his past failures settled on Elias, heavy as a shroud. He had broken a promise to a land he had not even known he was making. They camped that night in a hidden copse of aspen, without a fire, chewing on dry bacon and hard bread. As they rested, a new sound reached them. It was not the wind. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of pickaxes striking stone, carried on the night air from the direction of the burial ground. Caldwell was not waiting for permission. He was already at work, as if that was not enough. When the moon rose, its pale light illuminated the high ridge that marked the eastern edge of the valley. Ayanna saw them first, her eyes sharper than his. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Look," she whispered. He followed her gaze. On the crest of the ridge, outlined against the starry sky, were figures, not shadows cast by rocks. They were men on horseback, motionless, watching the trail that led out of the valley. It was not Kiefer and Smalls. This was a second team, and they were not behind them. They were in front, waiting. They were trapped. The dawn did not break. It seeped into the world, a creeping gray that turned the snow-covered landscape into a realm of ghosts. A thick fog, born from the melting snow in the frigid air, rose from the valley floor, clinging to the rocks and trees. swallowing sound and sight. It was the perfect shroud for an ambush. They moved through the eerie silence, leading the pony, every sense straining against the thick, white curtain. Tommy, bundled in maize wool coat, was a dead weight, his breathing shallow and ragged. The first shot came from nowhere, a flat crack that was instantly muffled by the fog. A chunk of bark exploded from a pine tree inches from Elias's head. He reacted instantly, shoving Ayanna and the pony behind a massive granite boulder. Pulling his Hawken rifle free, a second shot whined past, unseen, unheard until it was already gone. "Kiefer!" Elias hissed, his eyes scanning the shifting grayness. "And Smalls, they must have found a high spot before the fog rolled in." "They cannot see us any better than we can see them," Ayanna whispered, her own rifle in her hands. "But they know the direction we must go." They were pinned down. To move was to invite a bullet from the mist. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunshots. A tense, waiting game in a world without dimension. Elias's mind raced. He was a trapper, a man who thought in terms of snares and deadfalls, not open battle. He rummaged in his possibles bag, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of a bear trap and a coil of thin, strong rope. "Keep their attention," he murmured to Ayanna, "but do not waste your shots." She nodded, understanding immediately. While Elias crept away, using the dense fog and the cluster of boulders as cover, Ayanna raised her rifle and fired into the mist, high and to the left of where she judged the last shot had come from. The report was answered almost immediately by another from Kiefer, the bullet thudding into the snowpack in front of them. Elias worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced. He set the powerful jaws of the bear trap, placing it carefully in a narrow gap between two rocks on the trail ahead. Then he tied one end of the rope to the trap's trigger plate and uncoiled the other end, looping it around a low cedar branch before taking the end back to their position behind the boulder. A simple tripwire. All he needed was for one of them to get impatient. They waited. The cold was a living thing, crawling into their bones. Tommy shivered, his teeth chattering, a sound that seemed terribly loud in the stillness. Then they heard it the scrape of a boot on stone, a muttered curse. Smalls, on foot, was trying to flank them. "Now," Elias breathed. Ayanna fired again, this time aiming for the sound, the bullet screaming off a rock face. It was enough. From the other side, they heard Kiefer crashing through the brush, thinking their attention was fixed on his partner. He blundered right into the trap. There was a sharp metallic snap, followed by a man's scream of pain and the terrified whinny of a horse. The fog swirled, and for a moment they saw him. Kiefer, his leg caught in the savage jaws of the trap, his horse rearing and pulling against him. He fell hard, his rifle clattering on the rocks. Ayanna did not hesitate. She burst from behind the boulder, not with her rifle, but with the tomahawk in her hand. She saw Smalls raising his pistol to fire at the now exposed Elias. With a flick of her wrist, she threw the tomahawk. It was not a killing throw, it was a warning. The steel head spun end over end, humming through the air, and embedded itself in the trunk of a cedar tree not an inch from Smalls's ear. The force of the impact showered him with bark. His eyes went wide with shock and terror. He fired his pistol, but his aim was ruined. The shot went wide, or so they thought. Ayanna ignored Smalls, who was now scrambling away into the fog. She ran to Kiefer, who lay writhing on the ground, his face contorted in agony. Tommy, roused by the shouting, was watching with wide, frightened eyes. She would not kill in front of the boy. That was a line she would not cross. She stood over the trapped gunman, her face a hard mask. Elias came up beside her. It was then that he heard the dripping sound, a steady plink, plink, plink on the rocks. He looked down. The bullet Smalls had fired had not missed entirely. It had torn through their last full canteen, and their precious water was now spilling out, forming a dark, spreading stain on the snow. Their entire supply was gone. The crisis of thirst, a slow and patient killer, had just begun. Ayanna turned her back on the groaning man and the immediate problem of their pursuers. The water was a far greater threat. "We must go," she said, her voice grim. "Leave him." "We cannot just leave him," Elias protested, looking at Kiefer's mangled leg. "He is not our concern," Ayanna said, her voice like flint. The water is—" She pulled her tomahawk from the tree and strode back to the pony. There was no arguing with her logic. They left Kiefer to his fate and plunged back into the fog, moving as quickly as they could. Ayanna took the lead, her knowledge of the land now their only compass. She led them away from the trails, into a part of the foothills that was a labyrinth of stone. They squeezed through a narrow opening in the rock, a passage so tight they had to unload the pony and push their gear through ahead of them. The passage opened into a small, hidden canyon, shaped like a perfect horseshoe. The air here felt different, calmer, sheltered from the wind. Moss grew on the stones, and a profound silence reigned. Ayanna stopped. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, as if listening to something Elias could not hear. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost part of the wind, she began to speak in the flowing musical tones of the Arapaho language. It was not a speech, but a prayer, a quiet request for passage. She was speaking to the land itself, asking permission to walk on its sacred skin. Elias watched her, and in that moment, something shifted deep inside him. He saw the survey stakes, the maps, the legal papers, all the instruments of his world. And he saw how utterly meaningless they were here. This place operated under a different law, a law that was written in the shape of the rocks and the direction of the wind, a law that was old when the mountains were young. He understood, with a clarity that shook him to his core, that he had spent his life reading the wrong maps. They found the body on the other side of the pass, as the fog was finally beginning to burn off under the midday sun. It was one of the men from the ridge, a young man with a pale, frightened face, now frozen in death. He had likely lost his footing in the fog and fallen, his neck broken on the rocks below. His rifle lay beside him, untouched. Tommy stared, his face white. Elias looked away, a grim tightness in his gut. But Ayanna knelt beside the body. After a moment of silence, she looked at Elias. "We will not leave him for the buzzards." Together, they moved the body to a shallow depression. They began to pile stones over it, building a cairn, a simple, rough tomb. It was slow, heavy work, as they placed the last stones. Ayanna stood back, her breath misting in the cold air. "Even the one who hunts us deserves a grave," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That is how we are different from them." Late that afternoon, they stumbled upon an old, rutted track that was once a stagecoach route. Nailed to a gnarled pine tree was a piece of paper, flapping in the wind. Elias walked over to it. It was a wanted poster. The ink was fresh, the drawing a crude but recognizable sketch of Ayanna. Beneath it, the words were stark, wanted for inciting a riot and destruction of railroad property. A reward of $100. It was signed by Sheriff Pritchard. The lie was so blatant, so complete. It took Elias's breath away. They were turning her into the criminal. They were using the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a club to beat them into submission. Ayanna saw the fury in his face and came to read the poster for herself. A cold, dangerous anger ignited in her eyes. Her hands clenched into fists. "They twist the truth into a rope to hang us with," she spat. "I will go back. I will face Pritchard in his own street. I will make him swallow his lies." She turned to go back, her movements sharp and decisive. But Elias stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He put his hands on her shoulders, holding her gaze. "No," he said, his voice firm. "That is what they want. They want you to fight them on their terms, with fists and guns. They would kill you and call it justice. A dead witness tells no tales. Ayanna, we need the truth to arrive alive in court." His words, and the surprising strength in his hands, seemed to drain the fight out of her. He was right. Her anger would only serve their purpose. She slumped, the exhaustion of the last few days hitting her all at once. He was thinking of her mission. He was thinking of the truth. That night, they found a small, sheltered alcove in the rocks and dared to build a tiny, smokeless fire of dry aspen wood. The small circle of warmth was a comfort against the immense, cold darkness. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the flames and Tommy's steady breathing. He was finally sleeping peacefully. "I saw the ocean once," Elias said suddenly, his voice low. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. "I was a boy. My father took me. I stood on the shore, and I could not see the other side. It just kept going. All that water. It made me feel small. It made everything men fight over, all their lines on maps, seem like a fool's game." Ayanna listened, watching the firelight play across his rugged face. She saw the boy he had been, standing in awe before something vast and unknowable. "My grandmother taught me the rain dance," she said, her voice just as quiet. "It is not to make the rain come. The rain comes when it is time. The dance is to remember that we are part of the sky and the clouds and the thirsty earth. It is to remind the land that we are still here, that we have not forgotten our promises." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the distance between them, a gap that had been as wide as the plains, shrank to nothing more than the space between two people sharing the warmth of a single small fire. It was a half-step, taken in the heart of the wilderness, a quiet promise made in the face of the coming storm. They reached the old willow grounds under the cold, watchful eyes of 1,000 stars. It was not a graveyard in the way Elias understood the term, with the neat rows of stone markers. This was a place of quiet dignity, where generations of Arapaho had been laid to rest in the embrace of the earth. Sacred bundles rested in the high branches of ancient cottonwoods, and low mounds of stone, weathered by a century of wind and sun, marked the resting places of chiefs and shamans. A profound peace saturated the air, a silence that was not empty but full of memory. The intrusion of Caldwell's work was a brutal violation, a scream in a silent prayer. It was not hard to find, near the base of a towering rock formation that the Arapaho called the Stone Grandfather. The ground was littered with the refuse of industry, discarded tools, empty crates, and the raw, churned earth of a work site. Pounded into the ground at intervals were the same numbered survey stakes they had seen before, a cold, geometric grid laid over a sacred circle, tucked beneath a heavy canvas tarp. They found the heart of the operation, dozens of wooden crates stamped with warnings and technical symbols, and beside them, coils of thick, waxy fuse cord. Elias knelt, his face grim in the moonlight. He ran a hand over the rough wood of a crate. "Nitroglycerin," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Unstable, dangerous. Enough here to bring down half the mountain?" He pointed to the lines of fuses, which snaked from the crates to holes that had been drilled deep into the base of the Stone Grandfather. "He is not just clearing a path. He is planning to obliterate the entire formation." Ayanna's face was like carved stone. She saw not just the destruction of rock, but the annihilation of her people's history, the erasure of their very soul from the land. This was a deeper violence than any bullet. While Elias meticulously copied the lot numbers and manufacturing marks from the crates into a small, leather-bound notebook, she took a piece of charcoal from their fire kit and began to sketch on a piece of tanned deer hide. She did not draw the crates or the fuses. She drew their placement in relation to the graves. She mapped the desecration, creating a record that a judge might understand, a picture of a crime that went beyond property law. It was then that Tommy, who had been watching, pale and silent, reached into the lining of the oversized coat May had given him. He pulled out a thin, canvas-covered logbook. "I took this," he whispered, his voice still weak but clear, "from the site office, the day of the explosion. I thought it might be important." He handed it to Elias. Elias flipped through the pages, which were filled with daily entries detailing work assignments, supply deliveries, and blasting schedules. And there, on the last several entries authorizing the use of nitroglycerin at the old Willow Grounds, was a signature, scrawled in an arrogant, impatient hand. R. Caldwell. "This is it," Elias breathed, looking at Ayanna. "This connects him directly. This is the proof we need." Their quiet work was interrupted by the sound of voices, low and weary, and the clink of metal on stone. A work crew was approaching. Ayanna and Elias quickly herded Tommy back into the deep shadows of a rock cluster, their hands on their weapons. But these were not gunmen. 4 figures emerged into the moonlight, their shoulders slumped with exhaustion. 3 were Chinese laborers, their thin frames clad in loose-fitting clothes. The 4th was a young Irishman with a shock of red hair and a face smudged with dirt. They carried picks and shovels, and their movements were slow, driven by fear rather than purpose. They saw the trio hiding in the rocks and froze, their eyes wide with alarm. The Irishman held up his hands, showing they were empty. "Peace," he said, his voice thick with a brogue. "We mean no trouble. They make us work the night shift. Say the ground is softer after the dew falls." One of the Chinese men, older than the others, spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "Mr. Caldwell. He say we work, or we do not eat. Our friend, Liu Wei. He say no. He say it bad luck to disturb the spirits of the dead. Yesterday, the trench wall collapsed. They did not dig him out. They just kept working." His voice broke, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The story hung in the cold air, a testament to the casual cruelty that fueled Caldwell's ambition. These men were not villains. They were victims, trapped in a system that saw them as just as disposable as the rock they were paid to break. Ayanna looked at their tired, frightened faces, and her resolve hardened. This was not just for her people anymore. It was for these men, and for the memory of Liu Wei, a man buried without a name in the service of greed. A difficult choice now lay before them. They had the proof they needed to take to a judge, but they could not leave the explosives in place. Caldwell's men would be back at dawn to light the fuses. They had to save the stone grandfather, but they also had to preserve the scene. Destroying the evidence, even for the right reason, could destroy their case. "We disable it," Elias said, his mind made up. "But we leave it all here, just as we found it. We make it so it cannot work, but so the judge's men can see what was planned." What followed was an exercise in pure, nerve-shredding tension. While Ayanna stood watch, Elias approached the crates of nitroglycerin with the cautious respect a man gives a sleeping rattlesnake. Using the fine tools from his gunsmithing kit, he carefully pried open the first crate. Inside, packed in sawdust, were the metal canisters. He worked by the faint moonlight, his large hands moving with an almost surgical delicacy. He was not a demolitions expert, but he was a master of mechanics. He understood how things fit together, and more importantly, how to take them apart. He located the small, copper detonator caps that were the heart of the explosive chain and, one by one, he carefully removed them, placing them in his leather pouch. While he worked, Ayanna undertook a different task. She took their largest cooking pot down to a small, spring-fed creek and filled it with water. She carried it back and began mixing the water with the sandy soil, creating a thick, heavy mud. She then moved along the line of fuses, methodically packing the wet sand over them, burying them, soaking the waxed cord so that no spark could ever travel its length. His work was mechanical and precise. Hers was elemental and intuitive. Tommy, wanting to help, tried to quietly move a misplaced hammer that was lying dangerously close to one of the crates. His hands, still clumsy from his injury, fumbled the tool. It fell, striking a rock with a loud clang that echoed through the silent valley. Everyone froze. The workers gasped. Elias shot up from his work, his body tensed for an attack. Ayanna spun around, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective glare that made the boy shrink back. She stared at him for a long, silent moment, her face hard and unforgiving. Then, the tension in her expression dissolved. A completely unexpected, genuine smile broke across her face, crinkling the corners of her eyes. It was the first time Elias had seen her truly smile. A quiet, breathy laugh escaped her lips. The sound was so foreign, so beautiful in that terrible place, that it broke the spell of fear for everyone. Tommy, seeing her smile, let out a shaky laugh of his own. The moment of levity was short-lived. The old Chinese man, his fear returning, spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. "You must go. Red Jack's crew comes at sunup. They are not like Kiefer. They are butchers. They bring the gun that spins." Elias knew what he meant. A Gatling gun. Caldwell was escalating, bringing in a weapon of war. Their small, desperate mission had just become infinitely more dangerous. They finished their work in a renewed silence, the weight of the new threat pressing down on them. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. As they prepared to depart, packing away their gear, Ayanna retrieved her charcoal sketch. She needed something to hold it with, to protect it. Elias, seeing her need, pulled the bone-handled dagger from his belt, the one she had placed on the map in the saloon. He offered it to her, hilt first. "Use this to pin it to your cloak," he said. As she reached to take it, his fingers brushed against the back of her hand. It was the briefest of touches, skin against skin in the cold night air, but a jolt, as real and sharp as a spark of static electricity, passed between them. It was a shock of warmth, of life, of a connection that had nothing to do with their shared mission and everything to do with the man and woman who stood in the moonlight. They both pulled their hands back as if burned, their eyes meeting for a split second before darting away, a sudden, unspoken awareness flickering in the space between them. They left the workers with a share of their remaining food, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity. As their small party climbed the trail leading out of the valley, Ayanna paused on a high ridge overlooking the burial ground. The stone grandfather stood silent and safe below, a dark sentinel in the moonlight. She drew a small, carved wooden flute from a pouch at her belt. She raised it to her lips, and a sound filled the night, a melody that was both mournful and defiant. It was a high, clear, lonely sound, a song for the ancestors, a promise to the spirits that they were not forgotten, a call for them to stand watch over their sacred home. The notes drifted down into the valley, a fragile shield of music against the coming storm of steel and fire. The trail Elias found was little more than an animal track, a path known only to deer and the solitary men who hunted them. It led them deep into a fold of the mountains, a place of shadow and stone, far from any route Caldwell's men would think to watch. As night fell, he led them not to an open camp, but to the mouth of a shallow cave half hidden by a frozen waterfall. From within, a faint warmth and the gentle sound of bubbling water emanated. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the clean, mineral scent of the earth. A hot spring flowed from a fissure deep in the rock, pooling in a series of shallow basins before trickling out into the cold night. The geothermal heat kept the cave blessedly warm, a natural sanctuary against the encroaching frost. It was a place of deep peace, a pocket of life in a world of frozen stone. While Ayanna tended to Tommy, changing the dressing on his arm and coaxing him to drink some of the warm, mineral-rich water, Elias attempted to make coffee. It was a ritual he performed with grim determination, and one that usually ended in failure. He boiled the water from the spring, added the precious grounds May had given them, and let it simmer over their small, carefully concealed fire. The resulting brew was, as usual, a black, bitter liquid that tasted more of scorched earth than of coffee. He poured a cup for Ayanna and handed it to her. She took a sip, and her expression did not change, a feat of stoicism that almost made him smile. "It is as bitter as my first love," he grumbled, taking a sip of his own and wincing. Ayanna looked at him over the rim of her tin cup. "Perhaps your first love was a worthy teacher," Then, it taught you what to avoid. The simple, dry wit of her reply caught him off guard. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. You might be right about that. They sat in a comfortable silence for a time, the warmth of the cave seeping into their weary bones, the steam swirling around them like gentle ghosts. The shared warmth, the isolation, it seemed to loosen something in Elias, a knot of guilt he had carried for years. That day, he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the fire. The day I led the survey crew into the valley. I remember the way the sun hit the rocks. I thought it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I was proud of my work, of the lines I drew on their map. I felt like I was helping to build something. He shook his head, the memory a sour taste in his mouth. I was a fool, a blind fool, helping men steal a church and calling it progress. Ayana listened, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She did not offer absolution or scorn. She simply listened, giving his confession the space to exist in the warm, steamy air. When he fell silent, she spoke, her own voice a quiet counterpoint to the bubbling spring. Before the mines came to the Black Hills, we lived near a river that sang in the spring. She said, my sister, Neva, was 2 winters older than me. She had a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. One day, some prospectors came. They did not speak to us. They just started digging. They used blasting powder. We did not understand what it was. She paused, her gaze turning inward, to a landscape of memory he could not see. There was a great noise, a roar that shook the ground. And then, silence. A silence that was worse than the noise. Neva had been gathering berries on the hillside. We found only her favorite blue beads, scattered in the new, raw dirt. My scar, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, came from a piece of flying rock from that same blast. The story fell between them, a weight of grief and loss that was almost too heavy for the small space. Elias finally understood. He understood the fire in her, the unbending will. It was not born of hate, but of a love that had been shattered by a senseless act of greed. Her fight was not just for the land. It was for the memory of a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. The air grew thick with unspoken things. He saw the faint, silver line on her cheekbone, and it was no longer just a scar. It was a story, a testament, a holy mark of survival. The steam from the spring swirled around her, softening the hard lines of her face, and in the flickering light of the fire, he saw a vulnerability she kept hidden from the world. He did not know what moved him, only that the distance between them had become an unbearable void. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, hesitantly, through the misty air. He did not speak. He did not need to. His intention was clear in the careful, reverent way he moved. She did not pull back. She watched his hand approach, her breath catching in her throat. Her lips parted, and a single, whispered moan escaped, a sound of such profound and painful longing that it struck him to the core. Touch me. It was not a command for possession. It was a plea to be seen, to be believed. It was a test, a question. Can you touch the broken part of me without breaking me further? His own voice was a low, rough growl, a sound that came from a place of deep, aching empathy. Show me how, show me where it hurts. Show me how to be gentle in a world that has only been cruel. Her hand came up and met his. Her fingers were cool and strong. She guided his calloused, trembling hand to her face, to the silver line of her scar. She held it there, pressing his palm against her skin. He could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of her life beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes, his entire being focused on that single point of contact. He felt the story of the rock, the explosion, the loss. He felt the strength it had taken for her to survive, to carry that memory on her own skin. It was the most sacred ground he had ever touched. His hands, so accustomed to the rough work of survival, learned a new language. He traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, with a feather-light touch. With each hesitant exploration, with each answering sigh from her. His confidence grew. His hands grew wilder each time, not with force, but with the courage to explore, to comfort, to connect. It was a wildness of the soul, a breaking free from the solitude that had been his prison for so long. He was learning to listen not with his ears, but with his skin, to the silent boundaries and permissions of her body. For the first time, someone was touching her scar not with pity or curiosity, but with a reverence that acknowledged the wound and honored the survivor. It was the beginning of healing. Love, he was beginning to understand, was a form of profound respect. A sudden, clumsy splash from the mouth of the cave shattered the spell. They broke apart, their faces flushed, their breathing ragged. Tommy stood there, holding a makeshift fishing line he had fashioned from a piece of string and a bent pin. He looked from one to the other, a confused expression on his face. "I was trying to catch one of those little silverfish in the pool," he said, his voice a sheepish mumble. "I almost had one." The sheer, mundane innocence of the boy's interruption was so absurd, so out of place with the profound intensity of the moment, that they both started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle from Elias, and then Ayanna joined in. A real, unrestrained laugh that echoed off the cave walls. They laughed until tears streamed down their faces, a release of all the tension, the fear, and the sorrow they had carried. They quickly turned away from each other, hiding the sudden redness in their eyes. Two strangers who had just shared something deeper than a lifetime of words. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, a new understanding settled between them. The past had been spoken. It had been honored. Now, it had to be set down, if only for a little while. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "We head for the Three Pines Bridge. No more looking back, only forward." Ayanna nodded, her expression serious. "Forward," she agreed. But the world outside their warm sanctuary had not been still. Before they settled down to sleep, Elias went to scout the trail ahead. He returned a short while later, his face a grim mask. He opened his hand, and in his palm lay two objects. One was a fresh casing from a .45 caliber Colt, the kind used by Red Jack's men. The other was a single, long strand of dark horse hair, caught on a thorny bush. The hair was from the tail of a big, heavy-shod draft horse, not a riding pony. "Red Jack's crew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They are sweeping the foothills. They are close." The threat, which had seemed so distant in the warmth of the cave, was now breathing down their necks. The fragile peace was over. As he turned to check his Hawken rifle, Ayanna stopped him. From a small pouch at her belt, she took a small charm. It was a single, perfect eagle feather, its base wrapped in red-dyed porcupine quills. It was a symbol of strength, of courage, of spiritual power. Without a word, she tied the feather charm securely around the stock of his rifle. It was not a gift, it was an anointing, an acceptance. It was a silent acknowledgement that his fight was now her fight, and hers was his. He was no longer just an outsider, a stray from the mountains. He was a warrior for her cause, brought into the circle of trust. He looked from the feather to her face, and in the dim, dying light of the fire, he saw a promise of a future he had never believed he would have. The Three Pines Bridge was a relic from a time of trappers and prospectors. A sagging span of heavy timbers stretched across a chasm so deep its bottom was lost in perpetual shadow. Three ancient, wind-twisted pine trees, for which the bridge was named, stood like silent guardians on the far side. It was the only crossing for 20 miles, a bottleneck in the rugged landscape. And as they approached it, a cold certainty settled in Elias's gut. It was too quiet, too perfect. They saw them as they cleared the last stand of aspen. Men, half a dozen of them, were positioned on the far side of the bridge, and in the center of their line, mounted on a heavy tripod, was the unmistakable, menacing form of a Gatling gun. its brass-cased barrels gleaming dully in the morning light. A big man with a thick red beard that seemed to burn against the pale landscape stood beside it, one hand resting on the firing crank. Red Jack. He let them get within shouting distance before he called out, his voice a booming rasp that carried across the chasm. "That is far enough. Whitlock Caldwell wants the boy and the squaw turn around now, and I might let you walk away." Elias pulled them to a halt behind a jumble of fallen logs and boulders that offered some meager cover. To go forward was suicide. To go back was to fail. The choice was no choice at all. His eyes scanned their surroundings, his trapper's mind assessing every rock, every tree, every dip in the terrain. He saw a massive, half-rotten pine log, thick as a man's chest, lying near the tree line. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. "Keep them occupied," he said to Ayanna, his voice low and urgent. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle, his movements economical and swift. Ayanna needed no further instruction. She found a stable firing position between two rocks. The Gatling gun was a terrifying weapon, but it was inaccurate at this range and consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. Its purpose was fear. Her purpose was precision. She raised her Winchester, took a steadying breath, and fired. Her shot was not aimed at Red Jack, but at the wooden ammunition crate beside the Gatling gun. The bullet struck the wood with a loud smack, sending splinters flying. It was a message, "I can reach you." The response was a torrent of fire. Red Jack's man began to turn the crank, and the Gatling gun erupted with a deafening, mechanical chatter, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas. A hailstorm of lead ripped through the air, chewing up the ground around them, shredding the leaves from the aspen trees and pulverizing the rock of their cover. Under the cover of that terrible noise, Elias worked frantically. He secured the rope around the rotten log and tied the other end to his horse's saddle horn. "Easy now, boy," he murmured to the animal, which was shifting nervously, its eyes wide with terror at the sound of the gun. He led the horse forward, using its body to shield his own, until the rope was taut. The Gatling gun fell silent, its barrels smoking. "Last chance!" Whitlock Red Jack bellowed. "Go!" Elias yelled, slapping his horse on the rump. The powerful animal surged forward, dragging the massive log behind it. It was a crude, moving shield, a temporary wall of splintering wood that lurched and scraped its way toward the bridge. Ayanna laid down another precise shot, forcing the gunner to duck. Elias and Tommy scrambled along behind the log, the ground around them erupting in fountains of dirt and stone as the Gatling gun opened up again. They were halfway to the bridge when a new rifle shot cracked from the rocks to their left, from a completely unexpected direction. One of Red Jack's men, positioned on a high flank, cried out and tumbled from his perch. Chaos erupted in the ambusher's line. Another shot came from the same position, this one kicking up dirt near the feet of the Gatling gunner. A figure rose from the rocks, a man with a long, drooping mustache, holding a Sharps rifle. He was limping heavily. It was Kiefer. "Jack, you lying dog!" Kiefer shouted, his voice raw with fury. "Caldwell's bounty is a lie. He pays half what he promises and leaves a man to die in a trap." Red Jack, enraged by the betrayal, swung his attention from Elias to the new threat. The battle for the bridge dissolved into a chaotic, three-sided firefight. In that moment of confusion, Elias, Ayanna, and Tommy made a desperate dash for the relative safety of the bridge's heavy support timbers. They almost made it. A bullet, fired by one of Red Jack's men at the dueling Kiefer, ricocheted off the iron strapping of the bridge. It screamed through the air and caught Tommy in the upper arm. Spinning him around, he cried out, a sharp, terrified sound, and collapsed onto the wooden planks. At the same time, Smalls, who had appeared from the rocks behind his old partner, was cut down in a burst of fire from the Gatling gun, his loyalty to Kiefer costing him his life. The violence was sudden, brutal, and impersonal. Ayanna was at Tommy's side in an instant, dragging him the last few feet into cover. Blood was soaking the sleeve of his coat, a dark, spreading stain. She tore the fabric away. It was a deep graze, a nasty flesh wound, but the bullet had passed through without hitting bone. They were lucky, if such a word could be used here. There was no time for deliberation. While Elias laid down covering fire with his hawken, forcing Red Jack's men to keep their heads down, Ayanna went to work. From a small leather pouch, she took out a fishing hook and a length of sinew thread. She struck a match, the flame bright and startling in the gloom beneath the bridge, and held the curved tip of the hook in the fire until it glowed red. Sterilizing it, Tommy watched, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "This will hurt," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She bit her own lip, her face a mask of intense concentration, and with a steady hand, she began to stitch the torn edges of the boy's skin together. Each pull of the sinew was a fresh wave of pain for Tommy, but he clenched his jaw and did not cry out. A drop of his blood fell onto the dusty plank, and a moment later, a single green pine needle, dislodged by the gunfire from the ancient trees above, drifted down and landed beside it. The old life of the land and the new blood of the conflict mingled together on the wood, the earth itself a silent witness to their struggle. They were trapped. Kiefer's intervention had created a stalemate, but it could not last. Red Jack had more men and the superior weapon. They needed a way out, a way to break the siege. Elias, his mind racing, noticed something. Near the base of the bridge embankment on their side, the earth was disturbed. A section of sod had been cut away and then replaced, the seams still visible. It was the kind of detail a trapper would notice, a subtle break in the natural pattern of the landscape. He crawled over, his heart pounding. He dug at the spot with his bare hands and found what he had both feared and hoped for. A wooden crate, identical to the ones at the burial ground, was hidden there, a length of fuse cord leading from it. Caldwell had mined the bridge, ready to destroy it himself to stop them. A desperate plan bloomed in Elias's mind. He pulled the crate from its hiding place. He could not detonate it where it was. It would bring the whole bridge down on top of them. But if he could move it, if he could change the direction of the blast. He worked with a desperate haste, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. He half carried, half dragged the heavy crate 20 yards away from the bridge, placing it at the base of an unstable rock face that bordered an empty stretch of hillside. He cut the fuse short, leaving only a few seconds worth of burn time. "Get ready to run," he yelled to Ayanna. He struck another match. Its flame flickered in the wind. He touched it to the fuse. It sputtered, caught, and began to hiss, a fiery snake eating its way toward the crate. He turned and ran, diving behind the bridge supports just as the world erupted in a deafening roar. The force of the explosion was immense. A physical blow that threw him against the timbers. The unstable rock face disintegrated, and a river of stone and earth poured down the empty hillside, a controlled avalanche that shook the very foundations of the canyon. The bridge groaned and shuddered, but its main supports, untouched by the blast, held firm. The path was clear. The sudden, massive explosion was the final turning point. The sound, far greater than any rifle or Gatling gun, rolled down the canyons and across the plains, a thunderous announcement that something terrible was happening at Three Pines Bridge. In the stunned silence that followed the blast, Red Jack and his remaining men, their nerve broken, scrambled to their horses and fled. And then, a new sound, the rumble of a wagon, the shouts of voices. A buckboard appeared on the trail from Dry Willow, moving at a dangerous speed, followed by a small but growing crowd of people on foot and on horseback. May Juniper was at the reins of the wagon, her face a mask of grim determination. Beside her and in the wagon bed were the 4 immigrant laborers from the burial ground. The townspeople, drawn by the sound of war, had come to see for themselves. They saw it all, the dead man on the ground, the bloodstains on the bridge, the wounded boy being comforted by the Arapaho woman, the shell casings from the Gatling gun glittering on the ground like deadly brass seeds. And they saw the faces of the Chinese and Irish workers, who began to tell their story, their words tumbling out, a dam of fear and silence finally broken. The carefully constructed narrative of Sheriff Pritchard and Caldwell began to crumble, washed away by the undeniable truth of what lay before them. In the midst of it all, Ayanna stood up. She walked slowly, deliberately, to the very center of the bridge, her rifle held loosely in one hand. Her sleeve was dark with Tommy's blood. She stopped and looked not at the crowd, not at her allies, but up at the wide, empty, Wyoming sky. She had been hunted, wounded, and cornered, but she was still standing. She would not be moved. The Laramie County Courthouse was a world away from the mountains. It was a place built of brick and dark, polished wood, and it smelled of old paper, stale cigar smoke, and the faint, dusty scent of law books that had not been opened in a generation. The air was heavy and still, a stark contrast to the clean, sharp wind of the high plains. In this dim, stuffy room, justice was not a matter of the heart, but of procedure, of paragraphs and precedents weighed on a set of brass scales. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, sat Judge Alastair Miller. He was a man well into his 70s, with skin as thin and translucent as parchment and eyes that were clouded with age. But behind that milky film was a mind that was still sharp, and a core of integrity that had remained unbent by the political winds of the territory. On one side of the room sat Caldwell, looking perfectly at ease in a tailored suit, his face a mask of confident indifference. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Davies, brought in from Cheyenne. Davies was a smooth, well-fed man with a gold watch chain stretched across his ample vest and a portfolio bulging with what he presented as evidence. On the other side sat Elias, Ayanna, and Tommy, with May Juniper and the 4 immigrant workers seated on the bench behind them. They looked out of place, like figures from a different, wilder world who had wandered into a formal portrait. The proceedings began with a stark reminder of the chasm between their worlds. As Ayanna made to enter the spectator benches, a bailiff stepped in front of her. A stout man with a drooping mustache and an air of self-importance. "You will have to surrender your weapons." "Ma'am?" he said, his eyes fixed on the bone-handled dagger at her belt and the tomahawk she carried in a loop on her back. "They are not weapons," Ayanna stated, her voice calm. "They are tools. They are a part of me. Not in Judge Miller's courtroom. They are not," the bailiff insisted, his hand resting on the butt of his own holstered pistol. The hypocrisy was lost on him. Elias put a gentle hand on her arm, and with a look that was both an apology and a plea, he nodded toward the bailiff, with a stiff, angry movement. Ayanna unfastened her belt and handed it, dagger and all, to the man. She felt naked without it, disarmed in a room where the most dangerous weapons were words. The first witness called was Sheriff Pritchard. He lumbered to the stand, took the oath with a straight face, and began to lie. Under the gentle guidance of Davies, he painted a picture of a peaceful, industrious community terrorized by a radical native and her drifter accomplice. He claimed Ayanna had been seen agitating his work crews, that the explosion in Coyote Pass was a deliberate act of sabotage, and that the confrontation at the Three Pines Bridge was an unprovoked attack on law-abiding citizens. "And this boy," Davies asked, gesturing toward Tommy, "what is his role in all this?" "The boy is simple," Pritchard said with a dismissive wave. "Easily influenced." She filled his head with stories, turned him against his own town. It was a masterful performance of deceit, and Elias could see some of the townsfolk in the gallery nodding, their own prejudices confirmed by the words of the law. When it was his turn, Elias walked to the witness stand with the heavy tread of a man carrying a great weight. He took the oath, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Davies began his questioning, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Whitlock, is it true you are a transient, that you have no fixed address, no profession to speak of?" "I am a trapper," Elias said, his eyes on the judge. "I live in the mountains." "And is it also true that you were once employed by my client, Mr. Caldwell, on a survey expedition?" "It is," Elias admitted. and a murmur went through the room. "And that your employment was terminated, that you hold a grudge against him." "My employment was not terminated," Elias said, his voice steady. "I left when I learned the true nature of his business." He then turned to the judge, ignoring the sputtering lawyer. "Your Honor, I drew a map for Mr. Caldwell's surveyors. I was paid for it. I thought I was mapping rock formations. I was not told that my map would be used as a guide for grave robbers. When I found out, I wanted nothing more to do with him." The confession hung in the air, a public cleansing of a private sin. He had admitted his part, and in doing so, had reclaimed a piece of his own soul. Then it was Ayanna's turn. She walked to the stand with a quiet grace that seemed to silence the room. She did not look at Caldwell or his lawyer. She looked at Judge Miller, as if they were the only two people there. She did not wait for the questions. She unrolled the piece of deerskin on the witness box railing. "This is a map of the graves of my ancestors," she said, her voice clear and strong. She then placed Tommy's logbook beside it, open to the final page. "This is the book where Mr. Caldwell ordered their destruction. This is his name, written in his own hand." She pointed to the immigrant workers. "And these men were forced to do the work, to dig in our sacred ground, under threat of starvation." Her testimony was short, sharp, and straight as an arrow. The land speaks for itself. I only translate. Davies was on his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Objection. Your Honor, this is absurd. A crude drawing and a stolen logbook. This woman is a known hostile, a saboteur who has admitted to destroying company property." He began his counterattack, a storm of legal maneuvering and character assassination. He brought forth two shifty-looking miners who swore they had seen Ayanna setting fuses near the freight wagon. He presented ledgers showing payments to workers who did not exist. He tried to twist Ayanna's words, to paint her defense of her heritage as an attack on progress, on civilization itself. The air in the courtroom grew thick and suffocating, the truth buried under an avalanche of lies. Caldwell sat back in his chair, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. It was then that the main doors of the courtroom swung open. Every head turned. A man stood there, leaning heavily on a crutch, his left leg wrapped in a crude splint. He was dusty and trail-worn, his face gaunt, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. It was Kiefer. "I believe I have some testimony relevant to this case," he said, his voice raspy. Judge Miller peered at him over his spectacles. "And who might you be?" "Sir." "The name is Kiefer. Your Honor, I am a private contractor. I was recently employed by Mr. Caldwell." A look of pure fury flashed across Caldwell's face. Davies shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is a disruption. This man has no standing here." "Let him approach," the judge said, his voice quiet but firm. Kiefer limped his way to the witness stand and was sworn in. He looked directly at Caldwell, his lip curling in a sneer. "Mr. Caldwell hired me and my partner to track this woman and the boy. But he failed to mention we would be up against a Gatling gun crew also on his payroll. And he seems to have forgotten to pay me for my trouble, or for my leg." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn ledger book. He placed it on the railing in front of the judge. "I have a ledger of my own, Your Honor. It details all the payments Mr. Caldwell has made to me over the past year, including the most recent one." He flipped open a page. "He hired me for a job at the old Willow Grounds. He just seems to have called it by the wrong name. He called it excavating for Aboriginal treasures." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was the final, damning piece. Desecrating a grave was a federal crime, a line that even the most corrupt territorial officials were hesitant to cross. The lie was exposed, the entire foundation of Caldwell's case crumbling into dust. Judge Miller stared at the ledger for a long, silent minute. He took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold as a mountain stream. "This court hereby issues an injunction, effective immediately, halting all construction, blasting and excavation at the site known as the Old Willow Grounds, pending a full federal investigation. Sheriff Pritchard, you are relieved of your duties, and you will be investigated for perjury. Mr. Caldwell, you will be taken into custody as a material witness and held for questioning by the United States Marshals. Caldwell's face went pale, his composure finally shattering. As two bailiffs moved to take his arms, he lunged to his feet, his eyes locking on Elias and Ayanna. His voice was a low, venomous hiss. "This is not over. Whitlock, a judge's piece of paper cannot protect you out there. The law of the land is one thing, the law of the wild is another. It was a threat, and it was a promise." They stepped out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light, the stale air of the courtroom replaced by the clean scent of an approaching storm. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the first fat drops of a summer rain had begun to fall. People from the gallery hurried past them, seeking shelter, their voices buzzing with the news of the verdict. Ayanna stopped on the courthouse steps. She ignored the stares, the whispers, the rain that was now beginning to fall in earnest, plastering her dark hair to her face. She simply stood there, her face turned upward toward the sky. She slowly, deliberately, opened her hand, palm up, and held it out. The cool, clean drops of rain splashed against her skin, washing away the dust of the trail and the grime of the courtroom. It was a silent dance, a quiet communion, a reminder that even in the world of men, the sky still remembered its promises. The justice of the courtroom was a fragile, man-made thing, as easily broken as a pane of glass. It lasted less than a day. Caldwell's wealth was a key that could unlock any door, even the one to the Laramie County Jail. That night, while the town slept under the steady drumming of the summer rain, 4 of Red Jack's loyal men rode into town. There was a brief, brutal exchange at the jailhouse, the sounds muffled by the storm. And by morning, the deputy was bound and gagged in a closet, the cell door was empty, and Caldwell was gone, swallowed by the vast, dark landscape. The news reached Elias and Ayanna at May Juniper's saloon, where they had been ensuring Tommy was safe and comfortable. A sense of cold dread settled over them. Caldwell was not a man to simply flee. He was a predator, and he would not abandon his hunting ground until he had made his kill. His threat on the courthouse steps had not been the rambling of a defeated man. It had been a promise. Their fears were realized late that afternoon. A rider came galloping in from the west, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with alarm. A massive fire had broken out at the Gray Butte mine, the main supply depot, filled with timber, blasting powder, and provisions, was a roaring inferno. It was a calculated act of chaos, a diversion designed to pull every able-bodied man, including the new acting sheriff and his posse, out of town and toward the mine. In the ensuing panic, as men scrambled for horses and buckets, Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was a trap. "He is not at the fire," he said to Ayanna, his voice low and grim. "He is coming here." They turned toward May's private rooms, where Tommy was resting. They were too late. The back door was splintered, hanging from a single hinge. May Juniper was on the floor, a nasty bruise forming on her temple, but alive. And Tommy was gone. On the small table beside his bed, where the canvas-bound logbook had been, there was nothing but a single, unspent cartridge, a message, an invitation. There was no need for discussion. As night fell, casting long, dancing shadows from the distant fire, they rode west, not toward the chaos of the burning depot, but toward the dark, silent heart of the mining camp itself. They moved like wraiths, 2 figures of vengeance against a sky stained orange and red. The air grew thick with the smell of pine smoke and something else, the acrid industrial scent of coal tar and hot metal. As they drew closer, the frantic barking of guard dogs echoed through the desolate hills. The main camp was a scene of pandemonium. Men shouted and ran, their figures silhouetted against the terrible beauty of the distant inferno. But the central processing area, A maze of wooden structures, conveyor belts, and ore carts was unnervingly quiet. This was where Caldwell would be. Ayanna dismounted, her movements fluid and silent as a hunting cat. Elias followed, his Hawken rifle feeling like a natural extension of his arm. They infiltrated the camp through the shadows, moving from one piece of hulking machinery to the next, the barking of the dogs growing closer, more frantic. They found him on the highest structure in the complex, the ore-loading gantry. It was a massive, skeletal framework of steel and timber that stretched out over a deep, dark quarry. A heavy ore bucket hung suspended from a thick steel cable, swaying gently in the wind. And on the narrow platform beside it, illuminated by the hellish glow of the fire, stood Caldwell. He was not alone. He held Tommy in front of him, a pistol pressed firmly against the boy's head. "I knew you would come." Whitlock Caldwell's voice was a triumphant snarl, carrying over the distant roar of the flames. "And you, the savage. I have the boy. You have my logbook. A simple exchange. Toss it up, and he can walk away." Ayanna looked at Elias, her face unreadable in the flickering light. They had the logbook and all the other evidence, tucked safely in their saddlebags, but she knew this was not about an exchange. It was about execution. "Let the boy go first," she called out, her voice clear and steady. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I do not think so. The book first, then we can discuss the boy's future, or lack of one." Ayanna looked at the ground, then slowly, deliberately. She unbuckled her belt and let it fall to the dirt with a soft thud, her bone-handled dagger still sheathed. She then reached behind her back and unslung her tomahawk, placing it carefully on the ground beside the belt. "I am unarmed," she said, raising her empty hands. "I will bring you the book. Let Elias take the boy." It was a gamble, a desperate play for time. While Caldwell's attention was fixed on her, Elias faded back into the shadows. He was a mountain man. Steel beams and high structures were no different to him than a cliff face. He began to climb, his hands and feet finding silent purchase on the cold iron of the gantry's support structure. He moved with the patient, relentless stealth of a predator, the eagle feather on his rifle brushing silently against the metal. Ayanna started walking forward, into the open, her hands still raised. "The book is in my saddlebag," she said, her steps slow and measured. "Get it!" Caldwell barked, his eyes darting between her and the shadows. He was growing impatient. As Ayanna turned as if to go back for the book, Elias reached the underside of the loading platform. He was directly beneath Caldwell now. He uncoiled the rope from his shoulder, the same rope he had used to move the log shield at the bridge. He looped it over a crossbeam, preparing himself. Ayanna saw him, just a flicker of movement in the deep shadows below. She stopped. "It is over. Caldwell," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, cold authority. "There is nowhere left for you to run." Caldwell's eyes widened in confusion, then narrowed in fury as he sensed the trap. He swung the pistol away from Tommy's head, pointing it toward Ayanna. "Then you all die here," he screamed. He squeezed the trigger. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The flash from the pistol's muzzle was a blinding star. Elias, seeing the barrel swing toward Ayanna, launched himself up from the beam below, his body a shield. At the exact same instant, a rope snaked up from the darkness, the loop of a perfect lariat settling over Caldwell's shoulders. The bullet meant for Ayanna's heart tore through the thick muscle of Elias's shoulder, the impact spinning him hard against a steel upright. He grunted in pain, but did not fall. Ayanna pulled back on the rope with all her strength. Caldwell, caught completely by surprise, was yanked off his feet, the pistol flying from his grasp. He teetered on the edge of the platform for a heart-stopping second before Ayanna heaved again, pulling him clear off the edge. He did not fall into the quarry. He swung, suspended and helpless, a human pendulum dangling 20 feet below the platform. Tommy, free and safe, scrambled away from the edge, his face a mask of shock and relief. The fight was over. Elias, clutching his bleeding shoulder, helped Ayanna haul the sputtering, cursing Caldwell back onto the platform. Caldwell's eyes were wild with hatred, but the fight was gone from him, replaced by the limp defeat of a snared animal. Ayanna could have ended it then. Her knife was on the ground below. It would have been easy. It would have been justice, of a kind. Instead, she took the rope she had used to catch him and, with a series of swift, efficient knots, bound his hands and feet. She would not grant him the dignity of a warrior's death. She would not spill his blood on this ground. She and Elias half-dragged, half-pushed their prisoner back down to the main yard, where the shouting and the chaos had begun to subside. They brought him before the assembled miners, the Chinese and Irish laborers, the men he had treated as less than human. They threw him on the ground at their feet. The men stared, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and dawning hope. Ayanna stood over the bound form of Caldwell, her silhouette stark against the dying glow of the distant fire. "The land has seen what this man has done," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "The people must also see." Just then, the sound of galloping horses filled the air. A dozen men, state troopers in official uniforms, rode into the camp, their rifles ready. The law, slow but inexorable, had finally arrived. The miners, seeing Caldwell bound and helpless on the ground, seeing the armed troopers taking control, let out a ragged, hesitant cheer. It was not a cheer for violence or for victory. It was a cheer of relief, a sound of men who, for the first time, felt they were being seen not as tools, but as people. In the quiet aftermath, as the troopers took Caldwell into custody, Ayanna led Elias away from the crowd, to the relative quiet of the camp's small infirmary. Her hands, which had been so steady with a rope and a rifle, now trembled as she washed the blood from his shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, a deep and painful furrow, but it had missed the bone. She worked in silence, her focus absolute, as she tightened the last of the clean bandages. Elias looked at her, a faint, pained smile on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "your coffee is still worse than a bullet." A small, shaky laugh escaped her. She looked at him, her dark eyes shining with an emotion he had never seen in them before. The fear she had felt when the gun went off, the terror of losing him, was now laid bare. They looked at each other for a long moment, the laughter dying away, replaced by a silence that was more profound and more intimate than any touch had been in the cave. Later, as they stood outside under a sky now clear and filled with 1,000,000,000 distant stars, a new sound drifted up from the valley. It was the long, mournful, and strangely beautiful song of a wolf pack, calling to each other across the vast, dark expanse. It was not a sound of menace, but of timeless continuity. It was a song for the end of an era, a lament for the passing of one kind of wildness, and a promise of the endurance of another. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, ground slowly but with an inexorable force. Caldwell, stripped of his wealth and influence by federal marshals who were immune to his bribes, was tried not just for the events in Wyoming, but for a litany of crimes stretching from the silver mines of Nevada to the boardrooms of Omaha. The logbook, the survey maps, and the quiet, unshakable testimony of the immigrant laborers built a cage of facts from which he could not escape. He was convicted of illegal mining operations, willful destruction of federal survey markers, and, most significantly, the desecration of a recognized burial ground. The sentence was long, ensuring that the only landscape he would see for the foreseeable future would be the stone walls of a federal penitentiary. Back in Wyoming, the aftershocks of his fall reshaped the community in small but profound ways. Following the federal investigation, the Laramie County Court issued a landmark decree. The old willow grounds and the surrounding valley were officially designated a protected preserve, forever off limits to mining, railroad construction, and settlement. At the entrance to the valley, Where Caldwell's survey stakes had once scarred the earth, a monument was raised. It was not a grand statue, but a single, massive slab of local granite. On its polished face, an inscription was carved in 2 languages. In English, it told of the land's dedication as a place of peace and memory, and below it, in the flowing symbols of the Arapaho language, the same sentiment was expressed, a permanent acknowledgement that this land had a history, a name, and a soul that predated any map or deed. The change was not just written in stone, it was written in the hearts of the people of Dry Willow. May Juniper, using the profits from her now booming saloon, established a fund for the mining families, ensuring that the men who worked the earth would not be abandoned like their fallen comrade. Liu Wei, the Chinese laborers, with a newfound sense of security, built a small, simple shrine on a hillside overlooking the town, a place to burn incense and honor their ancestors, their quiet faith now given a visible space in the community. Perhaps the most surprising change came from the pulpit. One Sunday, the preacher, whose face was etched with a deep and humbling shame, stood before his congregation and delivered a sermon not on God's law, but on his own failings. He spoke of his arrogance, of his blindness, and he publicly asked for forgiveness, not from God, but from the people he had wronged. It did not erase the prejudice from every heart in town, but it was a beginning. The trajectory of Dry Willow had shifted. It had learned, through fire and blood, to stand on the side of life. The lives of the 2 people at the center of the storm found new, quieter paths. Elias Whitlock did not return to his solitary existence in the high mountains. His guilt had been transformed into a sense of profound responsibility. He accepted a position created by the new Territorial Commission, a job for which he was uniquely suited. He became the official scout and warden of the newly formed Bighorn Preserve. He no longer drew lines on maps for others to exploit. He walked the ancient trails to protect them. He spent his days watching over the elk herds, clearing fallen trees from the game trails, and ensuring the promises made on paper were kept on the land. He had left his cave, not to rejoin the world of men, but to become a true guardian of the wilderness he loved. He had found his purpose not in escaping his past, but in serving the future of the land itself. Ayana, too, found a new role, one that bridged the 2 worlds she now walked between. Her courage and her clear, unwavering voice had earned her the respect of both her own people and the officials in Laramie. She became the official liaison between the Arapaho Council and the county seat, a translator not just of words, but of cultures. She spent her days teaching the Arapaho children the old ways, the stories of the land, and the language of their ancestors. But she also taught them English, giving them the tools they would need to speak for themselves in the changing world. And in the afternoons, she would bring a few of the town's children, including a fully recovered and adoring Tommy, to the edge of the preserve, teaching them the Arapaho names for the plants and the animals, showing them how to read the clouds and listen to the wind. She was weaving the 2 worlds together, one child, one word, one story at a time. Their love did not burn with the desperate intensity of that night in the cave. It settled into something deeper, stronger, as enduring as the mountains themselves. It was a love of quiet companionship, of shared purpose, of a profound and unspoken understanding. They did not live together in a single house, for their duties kept them moving between the plains and the mountains, between the tribe and the town. But their paths were now inextricably intertwined. They had a ritual. Every year, at the start of the summer rainy season, they would meet at the 3 Pines Bridge. It was no longer a place of violence and fear, but a monument to their own survival and the beginning of their life together. On one such afternoon, as a soft rain fell, they stood in the middle of the bridge, watching the water rush through the chasm below. Elias had brought a thermos of coffee, a brew he had spent the better part of the year trying to perfect. He poured her a cup. She sipped it, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "It is better," she said, "almost good." He grinned, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "I promised I would learn to make a decent cup of coffee one day." She looked out at the rain-swept landscape, at the greening hills and the dark, wet pines. "The land has taught you well," she replied. One evening, they rode out onto the high plains as a storm gathered in the west. The air was electric, the sky a dramatic canvas of purple and gray. There, in the vast, open space, with the wind whipping her hair and the first drops of rain beginning to fall, Ayanna began to dance. It was not a performance. It was a prayer, a conversation with the sky. Her movements were simple, graceful, her bare feet moving in a rhythm as old as the land itself. Elias did not join her, but he stood witness, his heart full. It was a dance for the rain, for the healing of the land, for a future that was not certain, but was, for the first time, full of hope. Two people, on a small patch of earth, standing together between two skies. The railroad would continue its relentless march across the plains. Other men, with the same cold ambition as Caldwell, would come with their own schemes and their own paper laws. The fight to protect the wild places and the old ways was not over. It would never be over. But something had changed. A seed of resistance, of mutual respect, had been planted in the hard soil of Dry Willow, and it had begun to grow. As the rain began to fall harder, Ayanna stopped dancing and came to stand beside him. She reached up and touched the thin, silver scar on her cheek. It no longer ached with the memory of loss. It was simply a part of her now, a fine, silvery thread that had stitched her past to her present. Elias looked down at the eagle feather she had tied to his rifle, now transferred to the band of his hat. He had worn it every day since that night. He looked out at the land, at the distant, brooding peaks of the bighorns, and he inclined his head, a gesture of silent, profound respect. The storm broke, and a low, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. In the quiet moment that followed, she leaned her head against his still sore shoulder and whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. "Touch me." He smiled, a slow, easy smile that held all the warmth of a sunrise. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Show me," he murmured, not as a challenge, but as a promise to keep learning, to keep listening, to keep loving through all the seasons and all the storms yet to come. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.